Something's about to happen that hasn't really happened in close to 20 years. Now, I started talking about this back in the middle of the summer when it looked like it was going to be a possibility. But now, here we are at the end of the year, and sure enough, Washington, D.C. is going to finish the year with more murders than the city of Baltimore. It's not just one factor that's caused this. It's a combination of Baltimore getting a lot better in this area and Washington, D.C. getting a lot worse. So to start out, I'm just going to provide a little bit of historical context for what's going on and how substantial it is. So this chart right here, you have Baltimore in the red, DC in the green, in the blue, and as you can see, it hasn't been since 2002, maybe 2003, when they had similar total numbers of murders. Then Baltimore stayed pretty flat, and then as of 2015, around the time of the unrest surrounding the Freddie Gray situation, saw a substantial spike, and then the rates remained elevated for the 5 years or so after that. Then this year, they've seen a pretty marked decrease. DC, on the other hand, saw a steady decline into the 2000s and early 2010s, when it bottomed around 2012. It's pretty remarkable how safe DC got in 2012. City of 700,000 with only 88 murders, which is still not great in the grand scheme of things, but compared to where it was a decade or two before when it was experiencing 300 and 400 more murders, an 80% decline is almost unheard of. So DC was really doing a lot of things right, or at least DC was in the right situation. There's definitely a good debate over what led to that big decline, but ever since then, it's been completely in the opposite direction for DC. In 2012, they were at 88 murders, and they've risen almost every year except for this one right there, well, those two, but almost every year since, DC has been on a steady uptrend, with the biggest spike, unfortunately, coming this past year. This year, they're up close to 40% over last year. There's a lot of issues, a lot of reasons why this might happen. I'm going to go into some of them, but just so we have the official numbers for this year, this is the DC Metro Police, so this is the official stats. As you can see, as of December 22nd, they're at 267, which represents a 36% increase over last year. Baltimore, on the other hand, as of December 22nd, is at 256. Now, one thing to note, while DC and Baltimore are similar sized cities, Washington does have a slightly larger population, around 700, whereas Baltimore is just under 600,000. So it's important to keep in mind that although for this video we're looking at the total number of murders, the per capita rate is slightly worse still in Baltimore, but it's remarkable how close they've gotten given how far apart they were 10 years ago. So you might be asking, how is it possible that a city like Baltimore, a city that's had so many problems and so much crime, how is it getting this much better at the same time that a city like DC, much more well-funded and, has much more resources, how is it that they're getting so much worse at the same time? And I think a lot of it in Baltimore stems from a change in the state's attorney's office. Ivan Bates, he took over for Marilyn Mosby in the last year or so, and he's really changed the attitude of the state's attorney's office. He's made focusing on lower level quality of life crimes more of a priority, which was very different than the previous administration, where they were actively choosing to ignore quality of life crimes. On the other hand, now Ivan Bates is making a point of going after these. And actually, most of the people in the city appreciate the job he's doing. He has one of the highest approval ratings among any public officials right now in the city of Baltimore, and I think he deserves a lot of the credit for the decrease in the murder rate. Now, another thing is that Baltimore's murder rate was so bad, it was routinely in the top 3 or top 5 in the country. It was so bad that any steps in the right direction would potentially improve it. So there's a lot of things at play, but I do think that Ivan Bates deserves some of the credit. Another thing, he's made a point of going after violent criminals through whatever means are legally necessary, which is, I talked about this in my last video about this topic, but it's referred to as like the Al Capone method or something like that. Basically, if someone is known or highly suspected to be a repeat violent felon, and they've also done something more minor that they can get charged with, and there would be a successful prosecution, then they'll go for that just to get that person off the street, even if it means, putting the more serious crimes that they don't have the evidence to prosecute on the back burner. So that strategy seems to be working. Another thing that's going on in Baltimore is an unprecedented amount of demolitions in old abandoned houses. Now, I'm in the construction industry, so part of me, it pains me to see all this old architecture destroyed, and it in some cases I think there's things destroyed that should not be, but at the end of the day, a lot of these neighborhoods, the housing stock is beyond where it's financially viable to maintain, and because of that, you get deteriorating conditions, and one of the things that stems from that is unfortunately violent crime. So while it may not be a direct cause and effect of tear a house down and crime goes down, I do think it does have an impact, and I can kind of show that. So this right here is the Baltimore murders mapped out, and this is for the year 2023. You'll notice up here in the Park Heights area, it's a relatively few murders relative to the rest of the city. Now go back even 1 year, zoom in on that same area, and it's one of the worst places in the city. Go back 2 years, zoom in on that same area, and it's one of the worst places in the city. Go back 3 years, zoom in on this area. It's one of the worst places in the city in terms of murders. So I think, and you can see that the changes that have happened just on Google Maps. You have, let's get over to somewhere further up Park Heights Avenue, but when you get further up Park Heights Avenue, you have going from dilapidated houses, and then a few years later, 2023, now we have relatively well-maintained areas and even some new construction over here where there not so long ago was dilapidated houses. So I totally understand that there's a lot of debate over what should and what shouldn't be demolished, and I'm fascinated by that debate, and I think there needs to be more of that debate, because I think it is possible to go overboard and just tear everything down, and then you're left with, I think tearing things down without a plan for what you're going to do is probably the worst, and that's definitely happened in a lot of cases. But when you're talking about houses that have been abandoned for, in some cases, 50 years, there's really not much you can do to save them. So leaving them there just creates it's bad on a lot of levels. It creates places for people doing bad things to hang out and do bad things. But then it also creates just this attitude and mentality of hopelessness. I mean, if you're living next to houses that look like that every day, how can you expect to, it's just not good for your psyche. And so that's something that, for the better or for the worse, depending on your perspective, that's something that the city has been doing. So now that I've talked about the Baltimore side of things, the question is, what is it that's going on in D.C. that's making the murder rate spike so badly? And it's not just this year. As we looked at earlier, it's been a steady uptrend since about 10 years ago. And I'm not an expert on D.C. I don't pretend to be, so I'm going to talk a lot less about D.C. just because I don't know it as well. But one of the things that I think is pretty obvious, even from an outsider's perspective, is that D.C. has been taking, basically since they reached their trough in 2012, they've been taking a much more progressive approach to crime and law enforcement. And this really echoes what Marilyn Mosby had been doing in the previous state's attorney's administration in Baltimore, where they don't enforce minor crimes and then they gradually increase the list of what's considered a minor crime to the point where virtually nothing gets enforced anymore. And I think the theory behind that of, oh, we're only going to enforce the minor crimes, or we're only going to enforce major crimes and not the minor crimes, I think that's a flawed theory, and I think it's been shown time and time again that you can't have a lawless society but somehow still be successful in going after the serious crimes. It just doesn't work that way. And I mean, this article right here is kind of showing that like DC has gotten to the point they've seen a spike in carjackings, and experts are suggesting that it's lack of consequences, and I have no doubt that that's plays into it. If a kid thinks he can carjack somebody and he thinks of it as just a fun activity on a Tuesday afternoon, then they're probably going to do it. And you can't. I mean, kids are going to be kids, and if they're allowed to get away with things, then they will. So it's important that as adults and as political leaders and as law enforcement, we set the standard of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And obviously, we shouldn't be allowing carjacking the way that DC and unfortunately Baltimore to some degree still is. And it's funny that right at the end of the year, right around the time that all the news headlines are going to come out about DC's massive spike in crime, DC's massive spike in crime, the DC Council starts pushing a bill to go back to research-backed solutions and more traditional criminology. And you'll notice, and this is, you'll notice that this article, if you get a chance to read it, it's on the DCist.com. But it's basically what's being proposed is they go back to a more traditional style of policing where, what a shock, you enforce the law and you don't let people get away with crimes, and you just take take a more focused approach towards reducing gun violence, have a basis in research around criminology. Like, what a novel concept that we would enforce the law based on research and criminology, as opposed to these like harebrained ideas that people with no background in any kind of law enforcement come up with. People that are purely politically motivated to win political brownie points are saying those are not the people we need to be listening to. We need to be listening to things that have a basis in research and criminology. And on the one hand, I think it's a positive thing that at least some people in Washington, D.C. are recognizing this. But on the other hand, it's sad that they need to come up with a bill to get through the city council to use criminological research to direct how they do law enforcement. That seems like that should already be a kind of a baseline from where you start with law enforcement. So, like I said, I'm no expert on DC, but there's this myth out there that the broken windows policing doesn't work, and that's just that's fundamentally untrue. And it's been pushed by people who have a more progressive lean when it comes to law enforcement, and they say, oh no, it doesn't work, and it's just oppressing people, and it's just going after people who don't have money and people in certain political classes and certain racial classes. And it absolutely can be misused, and it absolutely can lead to bad things happening, and it's important that there's oversight, and it's but the flip side of just allowing crime to happen because you don't really have any you don't want to allow law enforcement to do their job, it's silly. It's New York in the early 1990s had 2,000 murders a year. It was one of the worst places really on earth in terms of violent crime. And by the end of the decade, they were, dramatically improved. And by a decade after that, it was safe on par with, cities around the world, which unfortunately America's cities have relatively high violent crime rates. So for a city like New York to go from one of the worst to, I would say maybe not world class in terms of safety, but up there is pretty remarkable. And a lot of that stemmed from cracking down on quality of life crimes and cracking down on youth crimes and not letting kids get away with causing trouble. Like I said, if kids are allowed to cause trouble, they will. So it's important. It's not you're not being kind to children or teenagers, letting them do stupid shit that's probably going to get them, arrested or killed at some point. It's the responsibility of the adults in the room, and like I said, the politicians, the parents, the teachers, everybody who's a little bit older and a little bit more experienced, to hold the kids to a higher standard so that they're not carjacking people and they're not breaking into houses and they're not doing all these things that will lead them down a path to which is inevitably going to include violent crime. So anyways, a little bit of an extra rant there, not just DC specific, but it's unfortunate to see a place like DC fall apart so fast, and I would argue is almost all politically driven. It's not a lack of resources. DC has more money than just about anywhere in the world, and certainly has more political power than just about anywhere in the world. So it's something other than that, and I think one of the biggest things that you can point to is the increasing I don't know what you want to call it, the increasing bent away from enforcing the law and acting like traditional law enforcement is a bad thing. It's not. It's needed, and even if you're not a fan of every cop, it's important that police departments are given the room to do their job and to help prevent crime. And then the rest of the community needs to. That's one thing. Now I'm jumping around. I'm kind of ranting, but going back to the Baltimore situation, I think Marilyn Mosby, in her mind, by allowing all these crimes and by letting people who commit serious crimes off the hook, I think she thought that what she was doing was going to make her popular. But it didn't. If we go back to this poll with Ivan Bates, he's been very clear in saying that he wants to prosecute low-level crimes. And despite that, he's the most popular politician in the city of Baltimore. And it's not even a racial thing. You actually look, and he's more popular among black Baltimoreans than white Baltimoreans. So that message is resonating, and we need more people that are willing to say it, and we need fewer people like Marilyn Mosby and fewer people like a lot of the politicians in Washington D.C. So that's all I got. Unfortunate for DC, but like I said, on the flip side, it's good to see that Baltimore is trending in the right direction. And thanks for watching.